Hey guys, what's going on? This is Andrew here today, and we're going to be doing something that I want to do for a long time now, and that is to review the Xbox Series S. A couple of months back, I did a video talking about how much I felt like the Xbox Series S was absolutely something to stay away from. But here's the thing, I didn't own the console at the making of that video. I just judged it based off of what I had seen in other videos and what I saw in the spec sheets. Now that I've actually had one for a while, I've had some time to mess around with it, and now I can actually properly review it. On top of that, I get to not only see this from an owner's perspective, but also as someone who happened to have the Series X as well. One thing I will note is that I don't have a 120Hz display of any kind, so I won't be able to take advantage of the 120 FPS games of this console. So was I wrong about the system altogether, or should you really opt for the Series X instead? To start off, let's talk about the Series S games themselves. I've decided to do this testing on my 1080p Samsung TV since the typical Series S user is the budget user that doesn't care about the 4K visuals of the next generation and just wants the new console knowing that they will get new experiences. I'm sorry for those scan lines, that's something that I really can't do anything about. Taking a look at these games I'm testing, each of them are optimized specifically for the console, so not only are the visuals better than the last generation, we also get the major frame rate improvements as well. Where these games aren't in 4K, it definitely feels like things are quite a bit cleaner and smoother than if you were to play them at the same resolution on the Xbox One and even the Xbox One X. Keep in mind that there are some games that play in a higher resolution on the One X, but we are still getting better visuals on the Series S thanks to the newer technology and better textures. As I just mentioned, the frame rates also happen to be quite a bit smoother, as well as being almost completely stable, so that is an absolute plus when it comes to the games that usually would have either a 30 FPS cap on Xbox One, or even an inconsistent 60 FPS target on the One X. It's quite obvious that the Zen 2 based CPU in the Series S definitely helps the console achieve the greater frame rates when comparing it to the One X with those terrible Jaguar cores, and I'm glad that we are finally able to say goodbye to the CPUs of the last generation. One last thing to note that this is still a new console, so we still haven't seen the full potential of the thing since there are still games coming to the previous generation. From what we are seeing so far though, it looks like things are looking pretty bright and positive. Next up, it's time that we take a look at backwards compatibility. Obviously, this is an all-digital system, so your physical games from the original Xbox and beyond aren't able to be played on the system, which means that you will only be able to play your digital library. I feel like them not including a disk drive on the system definitely was an odd move when considering how much Microsoft has been pushing backwards compatibility over the past few years, especially when considering that someone would have to rebuy the games they already had physically dating back to the Xbox 360 and original Xbox if they wanted to play it again on their Series S. I happen to own over 80 games on both my original Xbox and Xbox 360, so if the Series S was my main console, this would serve as a major inconvenience to me. Now that my rant is over, let's actually dig into the games and talk about how they are in general. Everything that I've tested ranging from the original Xbox all the way to the Xbox One didn't seem to run into any issues, and in all cases they ran better than if they were played on Xbox One and One X and even the original hardware. That's great news because that basically means that the new Xboxes become the definitive place to play a majority of these games, and that means that those who don't typically hold on to their older systems can sell them towards newer hardware without losing anything. One thing that needs to be noted with the Xbox One backwards compatibility is that if you were playing a game that usually would have an Xbox One X enhancement, you don't get to take advantage of that feature and you are left with the base Xbox One version unless there is a specific enhancement for the Series S. I'm not exactly sure why this is, but my guess is that since the Xbox One X had the better GPU on paper for higher resolutions without ray tracing, 6 teraflops compared to 4 teraflops on the Series S, it means that the Series S would struggle to play those versions of the game. As much as a backwards compatibility plays really well on the system, the lack of the disk drive and a GPU less powerful than the One X when not talking ray tracing definitely poses as a major downside when comparing it to the Series X. Our next topic is going to be possibly the biggest feature of all of the next-gen consoles, the load times. This is a huge thing to cover because we've been dealing with the inconvenience of waiting for games to load for a really long time, and we're now seeing a major improvement thanks to the inclusion of the SSDs in these new consoles. When comparing the Series S to the last generation of consoles, you will notice a huge difference in the load times. Some of these games shown here are Series S optimized, but some of the others are just games that we simply plopped onto the system without any enhancements, and they still boot up extremely fast. My best example happens to be one of my favorite games from the original Xbox, MX Unleashed, in which it used to take roughly a minute or longer for me to start playing on any kind of hardware I've tested the game on, but it now basically loads instantly when running it on the Series S. It is insane what kind of improvement we have received over the last gen, and it makes me wonder how much better it can really get. other than just game load times, we really have to talk about my favorite exclusive Xbox features itself, quicker zoom. As a person who typically plays more than one game a day, it's cool to be able to jump back and forth between games and be right where I left off almost instantly. You aren't just limited to the Series S games either, you can also switch between backwards compatible titles as well. At first I didn't see myself really caring for this feature, but I've been using it a ton ever since I got my Series X at launch, so the trend continues here on my Series S. So up until now, we have tested this console on my 1080p TV, but what happens if someone does happen to own a 4K TV? Should they go for the Series X by default? Based on what I've tested today, no actually. The Series S has a max output of 4K, so the resolution is supported. On top of that, the games are upscaled to that resolution, some games will actually play at that resolution, and they still look pretty sharp despite being at a lower quality than the Series X. As someone who owns a Series X, I don't personally feel like I'm missing much when playing on a Series S in terms of visuals. It's noticeable in some cases, but overall the games still look next gen even at the lower resolution. So in that regard, don't feel like you need to go for the better console just because you have a decent TV, because games will still look great. We're now going to be talking about the main reason that I got a Series S despite being a Series X owner, and that is for dev mode. Dev mode is basically a mode that you can buy for $20 to allow your console to turn into a development kit and also be allowed to run unsigned code, which means that emulation can be done. I have always been interested in emulation on various different kinds of hardware, and considering I wanted to save on storage for my Series X, I figured it would be awesome to get this console as an emulation beast. When it comes to emulation, the most important hardware is the CPU and RAM, and since the S is running the same CPU with a lower clock speed and the same RAM with a lower quantity compared to the Series X, you really aren't getting a major difference in performance on the cheaper console. On top of that, the Zen 2 CPU is better than my i7-4770K in my PC, so that makes this become my best possible option for emulation outside of my Series X, especially on the TV with its small form factor where I can just fit it right under there. Right here, these games are running with the highest graphical preset in RetroArch. At the moment, I am running them off of my external hard drive before I actually get into figuring out what I want on the system, but that isn't really affecting the results much at all. As someone who hasn't upgraded my PC in almost 8 years now, this is the best emulation I have ever seen in person so far. The games running here almost run flawlessly, and I can almost bet that the Series X would do only slightly better. One thing you definitely have to worry about if you are having this as your all-in-one console is the amount of storage that you want to dedicate to emulation itself, because if you were to change your mind later on, it would end up wiping all of your data to make the change. Although there is an option to back up the data. Overall, I am absolutely shocked for how easy this was to set up, and most notably, I can't believe that a $300 console is actually able to play GameCube games in 4K. Definitely check out some tutorial videos to get this done if you want to get this set up yourself. Speaking of storage, it's now time to talk about a serious issue across all the new systems, especially the one that we are looking at today. As of the making of this video, the Series S only has 512GB of internal storage, which wasn't even enough during the Xbox One days, and that means that you have a limited amount of space for storing your games. Looking at the picture that is shown right here, there are barely any games installed on here, and this was taken even before I installed RetroArch, and on top of that, you can't dedicate storage on dev mode unless you have 50GB of space on your SSD. You can expand on the storage, but at the moment, Microsoft's only option is their proprietary 1TB expansion card that goes for $220, which would bring the console to be more expensive than the more powerful Xbox Series X that comes with the 1TB of internal storage, which still isn't enough. Your only other option for storage expansion would be to get an external hard drive, but you are only able to store your Series S games on there, not play them. However, you can play your backwards compatible titles off of that, as well as the ROMs on RetroArch depending on the console that you're emulating, but you would lose those fast load times with that. The idea of all this is really annoying, and unfortunately, you can't really escape this problem no matter what next-gen console you opt for. So now that we're here at the end of the video, was I wrong about the console? Here's the thing. I absolutely love this console right now. It has an amazing concept, and I can definitely see why it's talked about so much at the moment. Going into this, I really expected to miss out on nice visuals and performance, but as it turns out, games still look very next-gen and very comparable to the Series X despite the lower resolution. The frame rates are still mega consistent, and the picture quality is still extremely clear, at least to my eyes. If you were to switch between the two consoles and ask me which console was playing the game, it would probably take me quite a while to figure it out. What I'm basically saying is that you aren't really missing out graphically unless you are that kind of person that can point out every flaw. The same goes for emulation. As I just mentioned, I had never seen emulation performance this great up until today, and keep in mind that I built a $1,200 PC in 2014 with an i7 that still holds up pretty well today that can do emulation. In all aspects of performance, speed, and visuals, I was completely blown away by what I was getting in this thing that was really supposed to be a downgrade from my Series X. Now we gotta get to the negatives though. Here's the thing, I still believe that most people should still opt for the Series X at this point in time if they have a problem with the amount of storage, and if they have a physical catalog of games from any Xbox generation. The console only having 512 gigabytes means that if someone wanted more storage, they would need to buy that expansion card, which literally makes the whole console more expensive than the Series X, while having no disk drive and less powerful hardware. Speaking of no disk drive, I don't understand why Microsoft couldn't just include it, especially with how hard they've been pushing backwards compatibility lately. This could have been the absolute perfect console for a budget retro gamer, because the performance of the old games are absolutely insane, and Microsoft just keeps adding more and more support for more games added down the line. So combining all the positives and the negatives, let's give my final take. Don't buy this console in 2021. Why do I say that? You know very well that in at least a year or two, this console is going to get the storage upgraded to 1 terabyte. At that point, it makes more sense to upgrade it to it, because you'll have at least a feasible amount of storage to store your games, which means that there will be no reason to get an expansion that would bring it to the price of a Series X, and the only downside to the system at that point would be the lack of the disk drive. But if you were really a person that is going all digital, at that point there literally is no downside to the console if there is 1 terabyte in the system. I will say that if you absolutely have to jump on a console now though, try to go for the Series X if you can. Anyway guys, that's my full review of the Xbox Series S. I had a lot of fun messing around with the console for the past few days, and I'm really excited to just sit back and relax with it without having to worry about making a video on it. It really is a spectacular console despite my advice to stay away from it in 2021, and I really am going to be playing this thing pretty close to as often as I play my Series X. Thank you all for watching this review. I hope that it was helpful for what choice you guys should make. I will see you all in the next one.